It's time for Defending and Commending the Faith with Joe Mott, inviting the atheist, agnostic, and skeptic to examine for themselves the evidence for the Christian faith. We are all limited by what we do not know and by the things we think we know but are not true. Dr. Joe Mott earned his PhD at LSU and was a distinguished math professor at Florida State University for 38 years, helping to write 3 math textbooks and authoring over 30 research articles in math. He is now the host of this radio program, Defending and Commending the Faith. Here is Joe Mott.
Hello to everyone. Welcome to the program. Followers of Christ are still being called into action for defending and commending the Christian faith. In the last episode, I listed 4 elements of evidence against Darwinian evolution. Let me briefly review them. First, spontaneous generation was refuted by Louis Pasteur et al. Second, transitional links are missing from the fossil record. Third, the myth of the Miller-Urey experiment has problems that misleads the public. Let me explain this last point further. Virtually anyone exposed to the teaching of biology since around 1960 has been told that in 1953, Stanley Miller and his mentor, Harold Urey, developed an experiment supposedly simulating the Earth's early environment, and within it was able to create the building blocks of life. That's the story anyway, but the reality is different. Let's go deeper. Hooking amino acids together in a chain to form a protein requires removing a molecule of water from each amino acid added to the chain. But amino acids dissolve in water. The presence of water actually prevents amino acids from forming into proteins. That is a major drawback to what is usually asserted that Miller-Urey experiment accomplishes. The Miller-Urey experiment used a mixture of organic chemicals, presumably mimicking a primordial sea, despite the fact that no one has ever seen or analyzed the contents of the primordial sea. The experiment subjected the chemicals to electrical shocks. These lightning strikes, so to speak, produced mostly destructive tar, which is not beneficial to life. In fact, the tar would have eliminated any vestiges of early life. The Miller-Urey experiment we now know did not simulate the early world environment, but the experiment falsely led people to think that scientists could create life in a test tube because the experiment could create some of the building blocks of life. But these building blocks produced by the experiment was only a few amino acids, far removed from what is needed for life. Nevertheless, the myth of the Miller-Urey experiment still remains in school textbooks, completely overlooking the problems with this experiment. Fourth, the medical doctor Geoffrey Simmons, and author of the books What Darwin Didn't Know and Billions of Missing Links, used the fact of missing transitional links and the shakiness of Darwin's claims to say that Darwin's claims no longer rises to the level of a theory, but perhaps only to a proposal of historical importance. Simmons says, Darwin didn't know that the function of every cell and every system in our body follows an intricate DNA blueprint. In fact, he didn't know much about the human body at all. Drawing on the most recent research and on years of clinical work, Simmons tells the real story about the human body's amazing complexity. The book, What Darwin Didn't Know, pictures the wonders of the human body in their true context, a marvelous system fashioned by an infinitely wise designer. In the book, Billions of Missing Links, Simmons reveals how interdependent structures and systems, massive complexity upon massive complexity, apparently came about all at once, whole and entire. There are no precedents, no in-betweens, no mistakes, no first tries, so there is no hint of things happening by chance. Simmons is not particularly fond of Darwin's personality. He says, quotes, "Much of Darwin's work reflects prejudices, false assumptions, assumed natural laws, and feigned research projects, as well as the reasonable thought of unnamed colleagues. Among the notables who have adopted his conclusions have been Hitler, Marx, and Stalin," end quotes. To those I would add Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, and Pol Pot. The Bible says that wisdom is justified by all its children. In other words, things like accepted cultural ideas, myths, worldviews, philosophies, politics, etc., enter to give a fuller picture of the character of a person. The eugenics movement will forever be associated with Adolf Hitler, whose quest to build an Aryan master race during the 1930s and 40s culminated in the Holocaust, the extermination of 6 million Jews, as well as all the deaths of multitudes of soldiers in World War II. That is a child of Darwinism. Hitler and Stalin all read Darwin's book, Origin of Species. Stalin became an atheist as a result. Richard Weikart, in his book, How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism, and Jerry Bergman's book, Hitler and the Nazi Darwinian Worldview, discuss how evolutionary thinking shaped Nazi thinking. That is a child of Darwinism. Allow me to interject this comment. For over 40 years, Dr. Jerry Bergman, with 7 graduate degrees in biology, chemistry, psychology, and evaluation and research, has chronicled the weakness and absence of evidence supporting the theory of Darwinian evolution. Don't you think that Bergman, with those credentials, deserves an audience? Let me now return to the topic of Hitler. He was involved in other things besides making the Aryan race the master race. For example, Hitler was involved with eugenics, but he wasn't the first to champion the idea of removing humans deemed to be unfit. In large part, Hitler actually took inspiration from the United States. Hitler said in the book, Mein Kampf, "There is today one state in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the United States." Supporters of the eugenics movement believe that people inherited traits like feeble-mindedness and poverty, which they interpreted to mean that society had an obligation to find a solution for this growing problem. Eugenics actually has some of its roots in Charles Darwin's writings. His theories about survival of the fittest inspired Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, to start the eugenics movement. Galton coined the word eugenics in the late 19th century. Galton first used the word eugenics to describe scientifically the biological improvement of inherited traits in human races and the concept of being well born. From that beginning, eugenics actually enjoyed a period of mainstream popularity in both England as well as in the United States and elsewhere in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Proponents of the eugenics movement believed it was the Caucasian responsibility to lift other civilizations to Western standards to cure many economic and social problems. American eugenicists tended to believe in the genetic superiority of Nordic, Germanic, and Anglo-Saxon peoples who supported strict immigration and anti-miscegenation laws and also supported the forcible sterilization of the poor, disabled, and immoral. The American eugenics movement received extensive funding from various corporate foundations, including the Carnegie Institution, Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman Railroad Fortune. In 1906, J.H. Kellogg provided funding to help found the Race Betterment Foundation in Battle Creek, Michigan. The Eugenics Record Office was founded in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, in 1911 by the renowned biologist Charles B. Davenport, using money from both the Harriman Railroad Fortune and the Carnegie Institution. Eugenics was something that many prominent people supported, whether vocally, financially, or politically. Presidents, economists, activists, and philosophers would surprisingly support the eugenics movement. Teddy Roosevelt, Helen Keller, and other revered historical figures supported the eugenics movement at the height of its pre-World War II popularity. That included Margaret Sanger, the founder of the American Birth Control League and of Planned Parenthood, whose ideas still prevail today in the abortion controversy. Eugenics allowed some people to justify their bigotry, who then would take things a step further by claiming that lesser races needed to be phased out. In this way, social Darwinism became a means to construct a supposed hierarchy of race and ensure that Caucasian people and their genes remained the ideal standard. This idea of hierarchy of races affected Hitler, where he thought the Aryan race was the master race. Eugenics and social Darwinism are the children of Darwinism. Before Hitler took eugenics to its deadly extremes of executing millions, many people considered at least some eugenics-related ideas to be completely legitimate, despite their serious moral implications. What is the lesson learned here? Here is one. Any bias can be taken to extremes. hatred can ensue and people can lose their lives. We see it now in the Trump derangement syndrome, which has precipitated multiple assassination attempts against the President of the United States. We saw it in Charlie Kirk's murder. We see it in school, places of worship, and drive-by shootings. It manifests itself when a few radical nations want to wipe out another nation. We see it in exhibitions of genocide. When will the world recognize that hatred can destroy everything we hold dear? Rather than supporting eugenics that removes people, we need to excise the cancer of hatred. Allow me to close this episode by reminding you, exercise daily, walk with God.
Thank you for listening to Defending and Commending the Faith with Joe Mott, a production of Wave 94 Radio in Tallahassee, Florida. If you have any questions or comments for Joe, please forward them to Doug Apple at Wave94 at this email address, dougapple@wave94.com. And be sure to join us every Monday evening at 6:45 p.m. on Wave 94 and subscribe through your favorite podcast app. Defending and Commending the Faith with Joe Mott.